The I Ching, or Book of Changes, is one of the oldest surviving works in the Chinese intellectual tradition. Its origins are rooted in the early Zhou dynasty, around the first millennium BCE, though the layers of commentary and arrangement that survive today accumulated over centuries. For much of its history, it has served a dual role as a divination manual for individuals seeking guidance and as a philosophical text reflecting on the nature of change itself. In both roles, the I Ching presents a world governed by patterns, the interplay of opposing but complementary forces, yin and yang, and the cyclical processes through which situations develop, peak, and transform. In its most familiar form, the I Ching is a book of 64 hexagrams, each a vertical stack of 6 lines. A line may be solid, representing yang, or broken, representing yin. The combination of 6 such lines defines a particular hexagram, to which is attached a short judgment describing its essential quality, and 6 individual line statements describing the significance of each position. In traditional use, these hexagrams are not simply read in sequence. Instead, a casting method, originally using yarrow stalks, later coins, produces a hexagram for the moment in question. This hexagram may contain stable lines and changing lines, the latter indicating a transition toward another hexagram. The reading thus consists of the primary hexagram, the specific line statements for changing lines, and the secondary hexagram that results from flipping those lines. This divinatory tradition is not incidental. It shaped the way most readers have encountered the I Ching for over 2,000 years. The casting process imbues the reading with a sense of contingency. A configuration is revealed at a particular moment, and its meaning is addressed to that moment's circumstances. Within this framework, the line statements become prescriptive. They are read as counsel or warning, instructions for navigating the change in progress. Yet alongside this prescriptive use, there has always been another way of seeing the I Ching as a descriptive model of change. The hexagrams can be viewed not only as symbolic portraits of situations, but as points in a complete finite system of possible configurations. Each line in a hexagram marks a position in that system structure, and when that line is weak, out of alignment with the pattern's natural balance, it becomes a natural point of transformation. The traditional casting methods in this view are not the essence of the system, but an overlay. They randomly select from among the inherent transformation vectors already contained within the hexagram's design. In the form most familiar to the tradition, each hexagram is built from 2 trigrams, each chosen from the set of 8, the bagua. The upper trigram and the lower trigram interact to create the symbolic and structural meaning of the whole. These 3 views, binary, quaternary, and octenary, are not alternatives but complementary perspectives. Together, they explain why the I Ching so easily aligns with other natural and human-made systems, governed by similar constraints. 64 is the number of codons in the genetic code, derived from 4 nucleotides taken 3 at a time, just as a hexagram can be seen as 3 doubled lines. In computer science, 64-bit systems directly mirror the framework, operating on the same binary combinatorics. In more symbolic traditions, the pairing of trigrams into hexagrams reflects the interaction of subsystems, domains, or forces. In all these parallels, the key insight is that 64 is a point of equilibrium, large enough to model complexity without becoming unmanageably large, small enough to preserve coherence and pattern recognition. Historically, the I Ching did not arise in the form of a 6-dimensional hypercube drawn on paper, but the logic was already implicit in its early arrangements. The 8 trigrams of the bagua were organized in sequences, most notably the Fu Shi, often called the earlier heaven sequence, and the King Wen, the later heaven sequence. In these, the trigrams are not random symbols but points on a cycle, ordered to express symmetry, inversion, and balance. Pairing 2 trigrams to form hexagrams extends this logic into a full space of 64 states, each connected to others by the minimal change of a single line flip. From a modern perspective, this network can be understood as a complete and connected graph. Every hexagram is linked to exactly 6 neighbors, and the pathways of change are fully mapped by the positions of the lines. The text of the I Ching, compiled and refined over centuries, gives narrative voice to this structure. Each hexagram has an overarching judgment describing the character of the configuration and 6 line statements, each attached to a particular position in the stack of lines. These line statements describe the tendencies and tensions that arise when a given position is in a certain state. In a purely structural reading, these statements are not predictions, but observations of what happens when the pattern is under strain, when a weak line, misaligned with its natural role, creates the conditions for transformation. The text, in this sense, is not a mystical add-on but a commentary on the system's geometry, capturing the characteristic ways in which one configuration leads into another. When we see the I Ching in this light, the number 64 becomes the organizing constant for a system that is both finite and rich, bounded and expressive. It is a complete map of the possible states within a 6-step binary process, structured so that every change is traceable, every transformation has a structural cause, and every point in the system can be located in relation to the others. This balance between stability and complexity is why the I Ching has remained compelling, not only as a divinatory manual, but as a framework for understanding systems of change. The mathematics of its construction make it universal, the historical arrangement of its symbols make it human, and, well, the interplay between the two makes it a model that has resonated for thousands of years. The I Ching names itself the Book of Changes, and its endurance as a system depends on more than the static beauty of its 64 configurations. Structure alone cannot account for change, it can only hold it. Yet change without structure is equally meaningless. A swirl of events without pattern or explanation. The genius of the I Ching lies in the way it binds these two together. The hexagram provides the form, the lines within it provide the forces, and the tensions in those lines open the path to transformation. A hexagram, once drawn, is not a fixed emblem but a momentary arrangement. Its 6 lines are not identical units. Each has a structural role, shaped by its position in the stack, its relation to neighboring lines, and its correspondence with its opposite across the hexagram's axis. In this architecture, strength and weakness are not moral qualities but structural conditions. A strong line is one that matches its position, yang in a yang place, yin in a yin place, and so holds the configuration steady. A weak line is one that is misaligned, yang in a yin place or yin in a yang place, and so sits under tension. It is in these weak lines that the seeds of change lie. They are the points where the existing balance is imperfect, where the pattern is already straining toward another form. The traditional divinatory language calls these changing lines, and in casting, they are the ones that flip to produce the second hexagram of the reading. In structural terms, they are transformation vectors, the coordinates along which the current state moves into a different one. The important point is that these changes are not random disruptions. They are determined by the architecture of the hexagram itself, the interplay between the fixed form of the whole and the live tension in its parts. Every hexagram in the system can, in theory, transform into any of the other 63 by flipping some set of lines. But the pathways are not all equally likely or equally coherent. A single line change moves the state to a neighbor in the hexagram space, a close variation in which most of the structure is preserved and only one element shifts. Such changes often represent natural developments or subtle transitions. Multiple line changes, by contrast, produce larger leaps, and in the space of hexagrams these are more dramatic reconfigurations of the situation. The I Ching tradition does not leave these transformations to the imagination. Every line in every hexagram has its own statement in the text, describing the nature of change when that specific line is in motion. From a structural perspective, these are not prescriptive instructions for conduct, but micro-descriptions of transformation in progress. The text records, for each position, what happens when a certain kind of misalignment occurs there, how it destabilizes the current form, and what new form it points toward. This is why the line statements are essential to the system. They articulate the mechanics of change from within. To read the I Ching in this descriptive mode is to treat the casting process as optional and the internal dynamics as primary. One begins by identifying the hexagram as a structural state. Then, one maps its weak lines, those positions where misalignment creates tension. Flipping these lines yields other hexagrams, which are not intrusions from outside but inherent in the original configuration. The resulting web of relationships, hexagram to hexagram, change to change, is the real content of the I Ching as a model of change. In this way, the I Ching's changes are neither accidents nor prophecies. They are the inevitable outcome of the interplay between the fixed order of the 64 forms and the living instability within any given form. Weakness, in this reading, is not a flaw to be avoided, but a signal of the next movement, the point where the structure is already in the process of becoming something else. This is why the I Ching, even in its most static diagrams, remains a book not of things, but of transformations. If the first task of understanding the I Ching is to grasp its 64 configurations as a complete structural space, and the second is to see how weakness in a line generates transformation, the third is to recognize that these changes are not isolated. They are patterned. The I Ching is not simply a jumble of connections in which any hexagram might lead to any other. Rather, it is organized into distinct groupings, affinities, and thematic zones. These structural clusters, sometimes visible in the traditional arrangement of the hexagrams, sometimes revealed only through analysis, create a higher-order map of change. One way this appears is in pairings. Every hexagram has an inverse, formed by flipping it upside down. Inverse hexagrams share their central dynamics, but experience them from different vantage points, as though looking at the same landscape from opposite hillsides. There is also the idea of opposites, in which every line in the hexagram is inverted yin to yang, yang to yin. Opposite hexagrams embody complementary forces. Each is the other's mirror image in the full yin-yang polarity. Together, these pairings and opposites give a sense of balance and counterbalance, allowing the system to register not just states but their symmetrical counterparts. Within each hexagram there is also a smaller structure, the nuclear trigrams. These are formed from the middle 4 lines of the hexagram, taken 2 at a time to yield a hexagram within the hexagram. This nuclear figure can be read as the core tendency or internal driver of the overall state, a kind of inner mechanism beneath the outer form. It often suggests why a hexagram behaves as it does in transformation, because it reveals the forces that are most tightly woven into its center. Most explicitly, the tradition groups hexagrams into the 8 houses or palaces, which are best known in the King Wen sequence. Each house is anchored by a single trigram and contains 8 hexagrams derived from it by changing lines in a set pattern. This is more than a numerological curiosity. Within each house, the hexagrams are thematically related, sharing structural qualities and often similar symbolic tones. A house, in this sense, is a region in the overall hexagram space where the transformations have a family resemblance. They describe variations on a theme rather than radical departures. From the structural perspective, a house is not a random classification, but a zone of systematic adjacency and affinity. When a line in a hexagram changes, it can connect that hexagram to another within the same house, reinforcing the thematic continuity, or to one in a neighboring house, signaling a shift into a different domain of meaning. Weak lines are thus not only points of change, but bridges between regions of the hexagram map. This regional structure allows for a kind of navigation. If you know where you are in the system, you can anticipate the terrain of likely transformations. The text of the I Ching encodes these possibilities in 2 complementary layers. The judgment of a hexagram is a macro description of the overall state, its posture in the world, its dominant tendencies. The line instructions, by contrast, are micro descriptions of change vectors. Stripped of their divinatory voice, these instructions are precise statements of structural instability. In this position, under these forces, here is the dynamic that could shift the structure. They may call a change favorable or unfavorable, but that is commentary. The underlying fact is that the changes are moved from one configuration to another along a specific path in the system. When these elements are read together, the houses, the nuclear trigrams, the pairings, the line instructions, the I Ching becomes a layered atlas of change. The judgments give the lay of the land, the houses define its regions, the line instructions chart the local roads, and the weak lines mark the starting points of travel. Whether one uses this to predict, to diagnose, or simply to understand depends on perspective. From a purely descriptive standpoint, the system shows how structure, transformation, and the capacity for manipulation or comprehension are all parts of the same triadic process. To manipulate the system is to act at the points of weakness. To understand it is to recognize how those points are embedded in a coherent geometry. The I Ching in this reading is not merely a book to be consulted, but a map of possible worlds, complete with the rules for moving between them. Seen in its structural light, the I Ching is not an arbitrary set of symbols, nor merely a vehicle for ancient moral counsel. It is a complete, bounded state space, built from a binary foundation but viewable in quaternary and octernary frames, in which every state is connected to every other by intelligible transformation rules. Within this geometry, weakness is not disorder, but the precise location of change. Groupings such as the houses or the nuclear trigrams are not superstitions, but systematic partitions and projections of the space. Because the system's completeness comes from its combinatorics, not from its imagery, it recurs whenever natural or designed processes resolve into 8 fundamental types, whose pairwise interactions yield 64 distinct configurations. Whether the domain is symbolic, biological, mechanical, or computational, the same logic applies. Stability and complexity are held in equilibrium, transformations are structurally determined, and the map of all possible states is knowable. In this sense, the I Ching can be read as the prototype of a scientific atlas of change, a model that can be adapted to any system with equivalent constraints. Its endurance for 3 millennia speaks not only to the power of its imagery, but to the depth of the structure it encodes, a structure that remains as relevant to modern pattern recognition and systems analysis as it was to the earliest observers of change.